This is the Extreme Stewardship Podcast, where we explore anything and everything that gets us better at making things good and good at making things better. It's been a while. I have been speaking on the theology of work and leadership and writing on the theology of work and leadership, but I haven't been podcasting on the theology of work and leadership until now. We're back, and hopefully we're back to stay. So tell all your friends. The next cluster of episodes is going to involve me reflecting on a series of books on the theology of work. There are a lot of books out there on the theology of work. Some of them are awesome, some are reasonably good, and some are terrible. I'm going to grab a few of my favorites and share with you what I like about them and where they forced me to think better about work. I'll disagree with them sometimes, but this is going to be more affirmation than critique. I'm in the process of writing my own book on the theology of work, and this is an opportunity for me to think out loud about what other people have said on that topic. Writing a book on the theology of work is, well, work, and work is always collaborative. So these episodes are me and my coworkers having a conversation about God's perspective on our work. When you read a whole bunch of books on the same topic, eventually, at some level, they're all going to start sounding the same. And that's not a bad thing. They're all trying to play the same game, win the same battle. There's also something good in that for me as a reader, because when I start to hear the same things over and over, it probably means I'm getting traction on the conversation. I'm starting to notice, oh, these are the basic things that keep coming up. I should pay attention to those. So in this episode, before I get into all of the specific books and some of the things that I really like about them individually, I'm going to walk through some of the things that tend to be said in all the books on theology of work. And these are all good things. So the first one is pretty much every book on the theology of work is going to tell the same 4-part story. So they're going to look at the biblical text, they're going to look at the scriptures and say, God is writing this story, and it has 4 major parts when it comes to work. The first part is how things were in creation before the fall. The second part is how things were affected by sin, by the fall. The third part of the story is what Jesus accomplished when he came. And the fourth part is how things are going to be in the end. And so when it comes to work, it's going to go something like part 1, the goodness of work, part 2, the corruption of work, part 3, the redemption of work, part 4, the restoration of work. And the most important point usually made in this conversation is the simple fact that before there is sin, so go to part 1 of the story, before the fall, before sin, before everything goes badly, there's already work. And it's fairly straightforward to go to Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and say, hey, look, God is working, and then Adam and Eve are working, and that predates sin. Therefore, we should not look at work as a necessary or unnecessary, for that matter, evil. Work is a good thing. And all the books on the theology of work are going to start with that premise. And then they're going to go to the second part and say, yes, work is a good thing, but also work is affected by sin. Work is not the curse itself, but it is affected by the curse. It is corrupted. And generally speaking, that first part of the story, we're going to go to Genesis 1 and 2. And then in the second part of the story, there are 2 places every book on the theology of work is going to go. One is Genesis 3, of course, and seeing how sin enters the world and affects work particularly. And then there is a bent in these books to go to Ecclesiastes, where a man reflects on what life is like under the sun and says things like, all my hard work is a waste of time. And these books are going to wrestle with what we're supposed to do with that, how we're supposed to face up to the fact that work is indeed not the way it's supposed to be right now. And that's the reality we live in. The third part of the story, the redemption of work, is looking at the part of the story where Jesus shows up and recognizing that Jesus has already accomplished something in relation to our salvation, in relation to our future. But there's something going on right now in the world where we say, oh, our work works differently because Jesus has already accomplished things. And if that sounds a little bit fuzzy, I will note now and come back to this when I talk about specific books. They are often fuzzy on this point. What exactly did Jesus accomplish in relation to our work? How did he do it? When did he do it? And what impact does that have on the here and now? But there's something going on in the story of Jesus already. Something in the story has changed. That's the third part. And then the fourth part, the restoration of work, the eternality of work. And the point is very simply, when sin and death and brokenness are gone, there will be work. So eternity is not the elimination of work, but rather the restoration of it, the restoring of humanity to our rightful place in working in God's good creation for all eternity. So that's the four-part story that every book tells. There are variations on which part of the story gets emphasis. There are a couple of particular books that go to great lengths to talk about how one part of that story has been neglected over the others. But all of these books are wanting us to recognize that work precedes sin and therefore is a part of God's good design for the world, and work postdates sin, meaning it will be part of our life with God for all eternity. And pretty much every book on the theology of work is going to talk about that in some way. The second thing that just about every book on the theology of work will do, and this was somewhat surprising to me, is nearly all of them will talk about work and talk about rest. And this comes from Genesis 1 and 2. God works and then he rests. And the invitation to humanity becomes we work and then we rest. And so these books will have discussions about Sabbath, about rest, about rhythms, about what some people would call work-life balance. That's a term that will get taken on in some of these books as maybe not the most helpful way to say it. But I was pleasantly surprised at how many books on the theology of work will say, hey, yes, there's work, but also there's rest. Don't forget about that. Some of them, it's a bit more of an afterthought. Some of them, it gets extended discussion, but it's there either way. The third thing that you will find in pretty much every book on the theology of work, at least those written in the last 80 years, is that every book on the theology of work must quote Dorothy Sayers. Dorothy Sayers wrote an essay called Why Work back in 1942. It is a reflection particularly on what does the working economy look like in the aftermath of World War II. So when the war machine dies down and the soldiers return home and life goes back to what you might call normal, what is work when it's not driven by the need of wartime production and so forth? And if you want to get your head into where the theology of work conversation is today, you absolutely have to read this essay, Dorothy Sayers, particularly her essay called Why Work. The fourth thing that shows up in all of the literature on theology and work is the connection between image bearing. So in Genesis 1, we are made in God's image, and the connection between that and work in Genesis 1 and 2, because we are image bearers, we are those who will rule or who are given the job of ruling over God's creation. And that's essentially what work is. So the theology of work conversation puts a lot of emphasis on work isn't just a random thing that we happen to do. And oh, by the way, it's not as bad as we thought it was. It is, in fact, what we were created to do. When Genesis 1 says, let's make humanity in our image so that they may rule, that means so that they may work. And what that does is draw a very close connection between work and meaning, purpose, value, significance, all of the things that we as humans are naturally bent toward pursuing. I want to know that my life has value, has purpose, has significance, has meaning. The theology of work literature is saying, yeah, that's true, that's right. And where that meaning and value and significance is going to come from is doing the things that God created us to do. And according to Genesis 1, the thing that he created us to do is work. And so this is where we spill into a lot of practical implications of all these conversations about the theology of work, because the point is something like, if God created us to work, And if we, by virtue of being creatures, receive our sense of purpose in the world from doing the thing we were created to do, then the fastest way to lose one's sense of meaning and value in the world is to stop working. And that has tremendous implications for things like retirement, for things like poverty and unemployment and homelessness, and things like COVID era economic policies. All sorts of conversations come out of the fact that, according to this literature, and I think there's something very true about this point, we were created to work. And we receive our sense of meaning and significance from doing what we were created to do. And so if we don't work, we're going to lose that. So that is a critical piece of this conversation. The next thing, this is the fifth one, is every book on the theology of work is going to attack what some have called a dichotomy between the secular and the sacred. This is something like there are material things and they don't really matter, and there are spiritual things and that's what really matters. And so I might be a carpenter and that's fine. I mean, it pays for my family's food or whatever, but my pastor, now that's where the really important stuff happens. And the theology of work literature, the faith and work movement, to put another term on it, has viciously attacked this idea. And I'm thankful for that. I'm naming that as a good thing. The idea that those who deal with souls are doing the real work in the world and the rest of us are just sort of sitting there ready to support that work is an enormous problem in the church. It is technically a heretical way of saying things. So the term will pop up in a lot of this literature, the term Gnosticism. Gnosticism is a complicated, convoluted sort of thing, but is intricately woven into the idea that there are spiritual things that are good and there are physical, material things that are not so good. And this feeds our idea that those who deal with the spiritual are doing something valuable, and those of us who deal with the rest of the world are not. And the theology of work conversation has very helpfully said that is wrong. That is not biblical. Look at 1,000 different ways that God affirms the goodness of material creation and therefore the goodness of working with the material creation. So a big part of the theology of work movement is meant to say those of us that do things other than what we have often called ministry are still doing what is good and valuable and right before God. The sixth thing that pops up in the majority of the theology of work literature and all these books I've been reading is that quality is a virtue, meaning when you ask the question, how do I honor God in my work? The first answer is do it well. It predates Dorothy Sayers, but the classic quote from Dorothy Sayers says, when we bring a carpenter into our church and we tell him that his first duty before God is to not get drunk on Fridays and not beat his wife on Saturdays and show up to church on Sundays, whereas we should be saying to a carpenter that his first duty before God is to do good carpentry. God is not honored by slothful work. God is not honored by poor craftsmanship. So the theology of work literature is very heavy on saying, rightly, again, I'm affirming this, they are saying we honor God with our work when we do it with the utmost possible quality. So quality itself is a virtue. Now, that connects a little bit to the next one. This is number 7, and that is the idea that there is a role for work for witness, and there is a role for work as witness. So here's what this means. Another way of saying it is that there is an instrumental quality or an instrumental value to work and an intrinsic value to work. So again, if someone says, okay, how do I be an office worker with a whole bunch of non-Christians around me, and how do I use my work as a testimony, as a witness, as a opportunity to connect others with the gospel and so forth? The instrumental value of work is that it can be a means toward that end. So work can be for the purpose of, well, why do I show up to my job? Why do I do this? So that I can share the gospel with other people, so that I can be a witness to my coworkers. And so the purpose of my work is not the work itself, but rather to get to the point of sharing Jesus with somebody. And the theology of work movement affirms that there are a whole variety of ways in which working in the world with non-believers does open doors to share the gospel. And there's a bunch of ways to do that. But it also affirms not only the work for the purpose of witness, the instrumental value of work, but also the intrinsic value, work itself as the witness. And so the point here is, again, I don't just go to work so that I can do this other thing. I don't work so that I can share the gospel only. I work because the work itself is good. The work itself honors God. And there are a variety of ways, and I'll talk through some of those as I get to different books, a variety of ways of how that plays out. But the basic point is, I don't just have this job so that I can share the gospel, because the job itself can be good in God's sight. The 8th point emerges again from that last one a little bit, and this is the idea that we should not draw too sharp a distinction between work and worship. So this is common in the way we talk about it. We will say that during the week we work, and then perhaps on a Sunday morning we worship. And the theology of work books that I've read, rightfully so, will say, sure, there is a kind of worship activity that happens on Sunday that is different than what happens the rest of the week. And that's good and that's right. But we should not go so far as to say that what happens on Sunday is worship and what happens Monday through Friday or Saturday is something other than worship. Worship is simply expressing what is true about God. When I affirm the goodness of God, the love of God, the righteousness of God, the holiness of God, the faithfulness of God, whatever it is about God that I am saying, that's worship. If it's true, then I have worshiped God in expressing something about him. And what the theology of work literature reminds us is that you can do that in your work. You don't do something apart from God all week and then finally join up with God and do the worship thing on Sunday. The way that you do your work is an expression of worship, because we are communicating who God is. And most importantly, God is with us as we work. He isn't sitting at the local church building all week waiting for us to show up, that he works alongside us. He invites us to work all week long. So these books have very helpfully drawn a much tighter connection between work and worship. And then the 9th thing, the last thing I'll say at this point about themes that keep popping up across all of the various books on the theology of work, is that work has value, work is worship, work is honoring to God and done with God, in part because so much good work is already an expression of love for our neighbors. The way that we sell things, the way that we build things, the way that we clean things, the way that we communicate things, the way that we design things, the various kinds of daytime vocations that we all have, all of these are opportunities to love our neighbor. It could be directly. If we are stay-at-home parents, there are kids, we are loving them. If we are teachers, there are students. If we are coaches or counselors or mentors or shepherds, we are guiding other people. And then there's the way that I clean the shop before a customer comes in. There's the way that I interact with people at the office when they come by. There's coworkers to love. There's customers to love. When I evaluate the goodness of my work or lack thereof, the first question I should ask is, who am I loving through the way that I go about the work itself? Not just the sharing the gospel on the side, not just the things I do on Sunday, not just the devotional time I have, so I hope coworkers will ask me about it and go from there. The work itself is an opportunity to love my neighbor. So there are 9 things that are very common, almost universal across various books on the theology of work, which means probably those are 9 things worth hanging on to. I won't repeat each of them when I get through every book in future episodes. I'm going to assume that those are on the table and then talk more in detail about some of the specific contributions that each book makes. So I hope that is a helpful start to you. And until next time, thanks for listening to the Extreme Stewardship Podcast. My name is Michael Kibbe, and I teach Bible and theology at Great Northern University in Spokane, Washington. Our editor-in-chief is Liam Olmsted. Art comes from Steve Kearns, and music is provided by Dave Murray of Derridoon Guitars. If this podcast has been useful or challenging to you, shoot us an email, extremestewards@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. And if you think it might be useful or challenging to anyone else, well, you know what to do. Ultimately, we hope that listening to this podcast has helped you get better at making things good and good at making things better.